while federal agents in Washington were adding a new name to the Treasury Department's specially designated narcotics trafficking kingpin list on the 21st of April, 2022, 1,200 miles south, in a sun-drenched estate somewhere in Jalisco, a young woman was scrolling through her phone, surrounded by the soft sounds of water cascading over a private infinity pool. The two scenes were separated by geography and by something more difficult to measure: the distance between the machinery of global law enforcement and the life it had, for years, failed to reach. The agents in Washington were adding her name. The young woman by the pool was Laisha Oseguera González, 26 years old at the time, daughter of Mencho Oseguera Cervantes, the man the world knows as El Mencho, the most wanted drug lord on earth, the architect of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, an organization that had already become more powerful, more violent, and more geographically dispersed than the Sinaloa cartel at the peak of El Chapo's reign. The fragrance of chlorinated water and something floral, jasmine or gardenia, sources familiar with the property recall, hung in the air of that estate. A pair of Bengal cats moved across imported Italian stone. Somewhere nearby, according to individuals with knowledge of the household's security arrangements, at least a dozen armed men maintained a perimeter that no journalist, no investigator, no satellite had ever conclusively penetrated. Laisha's world was not hidden because it was modest. It was hidden because it was impregnable. What does it mean to be born the daughter of the most feared cartel boss alive? How do you build an identity inside an empire built on disappearances, dismemberments, and billions of dollars in cocaine, methamphetamine, and fentanyl? What did Laisha Oseguera González actually know, and when did she know it? And what finally forced the machinery of international sanctions to put her name on the same list as her father, a man the DEA has offered $10 million to capture? The answers require going somewhere most documentaries about the cartel world never go: inside the life of the woman who lived in its center, not as a victim, not merely as a bystander, but as an active participant in one of the most sophisticated criminal networks the Western Hemisphere has ever produced. To understand Laisha, you first need to understand the world she was born into, and how deliberately that world was constructed to look like something else entirely. Mencho Oseguera Cervantes did not begin as a king. He was born in 1966 in the municipality of Ursulo Galvan in Veracruz, Mexico, a place so far from the corridors of cartel power that his eventual rise reads less like biography and more like mythology. He came from poverty that was not romantic or cinematic, the kind that closes doors before a child is old enough to know what doors are. He worked briefly as a police officer, and later as a member of the Guadalajara cartel's enforcement structure, learning the architecture of organized crime from the inside. By the time he founded the Jalisco New Generation Cartel around 2010, Mencho Oseguera Cervantes had spent decades studying how empires were built, and more importantly, how they collapsed. The CJNG's founding philosophy was different from its predecessors in one critical respect. It was not merely a trafficking organization. It was a territorial project, a military project, a political project. The cartel acquired anti-aircraft weapons, armored vehicles, and military-grade communications infrastructure. It deployed drones, not for surveillance but as delivery systems for explosive devices. It operated a media wing. It produced recruitment videos. It answered challenges from rival organizations, not with single retaliatory strikes, but with campaigns of sustained, coordinated violence, designed to make resistance appear not just futile, but cosmically inadvisable. Within a decade of its founding, the CJNG had established a presence in at least 30 of Mexico's 32 states and in more than 50 countries worldwide. The DEA classified it as one of the 5 most dangerous transnational criminal organizations on the planet. Into this world, Laisha Oseguera González was born. Exact birth date protected, but documented records place her in her late 20s at the time of her sanctioning. She was, by most accounts, from individuals familiar with the family's internal dynamics, the youngest and most guarded of El Mencho's children. Her older brother, Rubén Oseguera González, known as El Menchito, had already been arrested, extradited, and convicted in the United States, sentenced in 2023 to 40 years in federal prison. Her older sister, Jessica Johanna Oseguera González, had been sanctioned by the Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control, known as OFAC, years earlier, in 2015. Laisha represented something different in the Oseguera family's public profile, the one they had managed, for years, to keep almost entirely invisible. She grew up, according to accounts from individuals with knowledge of the family, in a state of extreme luxury that was simultaneously extreme concealment. Estates in Jalisco and Colima, properties whose legal ownership was buried beneath layers of shell companies and straw buyers. Private tutors rather than conventional schools where classmates' families might ask questions. A social circle carefully curated to ensure that anyone who knew Laisha understood, implicitly and explicitly, the cost of indiscretion. She was not a secret because she was unimportant. She was a secret because protecting her was protecting something El Mencho valued more than territory, more than revenue, more than his own freedom. The appearance of a life his violence had purchased. There is one detail in this story that still divides the analysts who study cartel family dynamics. At what point does a child born into this world become responsible for it? Laisha did not choose her father, but the question of what she chose afterward, that is something the record eventually answers. The life that OFAC documents and journalistic investigations have pieced together is staggering in its specificity and its contradictions. Laisha Oseguera González moved through the world of extreme luxury with the practiced ease of someone who had never known anything else. Court records, Treasury Department filings, and investigative reporting by Mexican journalists, several of whom requested anonymity given the obvious risks involved in covering the Oseguera family, describe a lifestyle supported by the CJNG's financial infrastructure at a scale that defied ordinary comprehension. Properties in Mexico's most exclusive residential zones. A wardrobe built around brands whose entry-level prices exceed the annual wages of most Mexican families. Hermes, Dior, Balenciaga, Chanel. According to OFAC documentation, she had access to private aviation, not charter bookings under her name, but aircraft whose ultimate beneficial ownership traced back through the same network of front companies and financial intermediaries that laundered the cartel's operational revenue. The animals were, in some ways, the most vivid detail. Social media accounts attributed to Laisha before they were scrubbed showed exotic pets, Bengal cats, as mentioned by sources familiar with the properties, and according to some accounts, other animals that required the kind of veterinary care and housing infrastructure available only to people for whom cost is genuinely not a consideration. The animals were not incidental. They were a statement. In the world of Mexican cartel royalty, exotic animals have long functioned as a specific kind of status marker, a declaration that the rules governing ordinary people's access to the world simply do not apply. But here is the question almost no one asks about this story. How does a young woman whose family was already under intense U.S. government scrutiny, whose father had a $10 million bounty on his head, whose brother had been arrested, whose sister had already been sanctioned, maintain this level of visible luxury without triggering consequences? The answer, it turns out, was not in visibility. It was architecture, financial architecture of extraordinary complexity. Keep that in mind, because the mechanism behind it is what ultimately brought the entire structure down. The CJNG's money laundering operations, as documented in multiple U.S. federal prosecutions and Treasury Department enforcement actions, were not crude. They were sophisticated enough to involve real estate acquisition in multiple countries, import-export businesses with legitimate commercial activity used to commingle cartel proceeds, and financial intermediaries in jurisdictions ranging from Mexico to the United States to Europe. Laisha's lifestyle was not funded by cash in a suitcase. It was funded by the output of a financial system specifically engineered to make cartel money indistinguishable from legitimate wealth. When investigators eventually traced the beneficial ownership of properties and business interests in her name or through entities connected to her, they were not following a simple trail. They were dismantling a structure. The OFAC designation issued in April of 2022 identified Laisha Oseguera González as an individual who had materially assisted, sponsored, and provided financial, material, or technological support for, or goods or services to, the CJNG. That language is precise and deliberate. It means something specific under U.S. law, that she was not merely a passive beneficiary of her father's enterprise. She was an active participant in its perpetuation. Before we go further, you need to understand something that recontextualizes everything you've just heard. The CJNG is not, in the popular imagination, primarily a financial organization. Its notoriety rests on its violence, the cartel shootouts, the burned vehicles, the social media propaganda videos showing armed columns moving through Mexican territory in broad daylight. In 2015, CJNG gunmen ambushed a federal police convoy in Jalisco, killing 15 officers in a single engagement. In 2019, a CJNG attack on a military convoy resulted in the capture and brief detention of the son of El Chapo, Ovidio Guzman Lopez, until the Mexican government, under fire from cartel forces, released him, an episode that became known internationally as the Culiacan bloodbath and demonstrated with brutal clarity that Mexico's federal government was not prepared to fight the CJNG at full force. In 2020, CJNG gunmen carried out an assassination attempt against Mexico City's police chief, Omar Garcia Harfuch, in a brazen ambush on one of the capital's most heavily trafficked boulevards, an attack that used armor-piercing ammunition and left the police chief wounded and 3 of his bodyguards dead. Laisha Oseguera González did not pull triggers. The record does not suggest she coordinated attacks, but the financial infrastructure that sustained her lifestyle was the same financial infrastructure that purchased the weapons, paid the gunmen, and maintained the logistics of an organization capable of those operations. The fragrance hanging in the air of that Jalisco estate and the sound of gunfire on a Mexico City boulevard in 2020 were not 2 separate stories. They were the same story, experienced from different distances. What investigators discovered when they began tracing the financial threads connected to Laisha was not a woman who had stumbled accidentally into the cartel's economic orbit. It was a woman who had become a structural node in that orbit, a name attached to business interests, to properties, to financial relationships that served the CJNG's need to move money across borders and jurisdictions with the appearance of legitimacy. The Treasury Department does not sanction people as a symbolic gesture. The evidentiary threshold required for an OFAC designation against a private individual is substantial. By the time her name appeared on that list, The case had been built over years. And here's where this story gets genuinely disturbing. The cartel's method of protecting Laisha was not simply to hide her. It was to embed her within economic structures that were, on their surface, entirely ordinary. Restaurants, real estate holdings, import businesses. The violence of the CJNG existed at one layer of reality. The world Laisha moved through publicly existed at another layer. Those layers were not separate. They were deliberately designed to appear that way. Up to this point, Laisha had been the invisible daughter, protected by architecture, by distance, by the sheer complexity of the financial structures surrounding her. But what seemed like permanent invisibility was only the prologue. The story of how El Mencho built not just a cartel but a dynasty, and what that dynasty cost, requires understanding the specific role that family played in the CJNG's structure. Criminal organizations at the scale of the CJNG face a fundamental operational problem. How do you maintain control of a multi-billion-dollar enterprise when the principal leadership is either in hiding, in prison, or under constant threat of capture? The answer for the Oseguera family was to distribute operational and financial functions across family members in ways that created redundancy. If one node was compromised, as El Menchito was compromised by his arrest, others remained. If assets were seized from one family member, assets held in another family member's name, or through entities connected to another family member, were insulated. This is not speculation. It is the explicit operational logic described in U.S. Treasury Department and DEA documentation related to CJNG enforcement actions going back more than a decade. Jessica Johanna Oseguera González, Laisha's older sister, was sanctioned in 2015, 5 years before Laisha's sanctioning, for her role in managing cartel-connected business interests. The pattern was not coincidental, it was structural. The revelation that changes everything in Laisha's story is this. The OFAC documentation identifies not just her lifestyle, but her function. She was not simply spending cartel money. According to the Treasury Department's findings, she was involved in managing and facilitating the financial operations that kept that money moving. The network of front companies, the real estate transactions, the commercial enterprises whose apparent legitimacy provided cover for the cartel's revenue streams. She was, in the language of financial crime investigators, a beneficial owner and an active facilitator. That distinction matters enormously. It is the difference between a daughter who benefited from her father's crimes and a participant in an ongoing criminal enterprise. There was one person whose role in this story would only be fully understood much later, a figure on the periphery of the CJNG's financial structure, whose cooperation with investigators eventually helped illuminate the mechanisms connecting Laisha to the cartel's money laundering operations. That thread, and where it led, is something we'll come back to. Think about this for a moment. El Mencho has been the most wanted man in Mexico for the better part of a decade. The DEA has offered $10 million for information leading to his capture, the same bounty offered for El Chapo at the height of his infamy. U.S. and Mexican authorities have conducted hundreds of operations targeting the CJNG's leadership structure. They have arrested cartel lieutenants, seized weapons caches containing hundreds of military-grade rifles, intercepted drug shipments containing hundreds of thousands of pounds of methamphetamine and tens of thousands of pounds of fentanyl. They have prosecuted CJNG members in federal courts in New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles. And through all of it, El Mencho has remained free, conducting his affairs from locations that have never been publicly confirmed, communicating through layers of intermediaries, surviving in a state of permanent, organized concealment that the U.S. government has described as among the most sophisticated operational security protocols of any cartel leader in history. Laisha's existence, and the specific way she navigated that existence, reflects what her father built with extraordinary precision. She was the human embodiment of his method, visible enough to function, concealed enough to survive, embedded deeply enough in legitimate economic structures that reaching her required dismantling something far larger than a single person. But there is a part of this story we haven't told you yet, because the public record of Laisha Oseguera González, the OFAC designation, the Treasury documents, the journalistic investigations, represents only the surface of a life whose deeper dimensions include something far more disturbing than financial facilitation. The CJNG is an organization built at its operational core on fear, not simply the fear of its enemies, but the systemic, institutionalized fear of entire communities, entire municipal governments, entire regions of Mexico, where the cartel's presence has made ordinary civic life functionally impossible. Journalists in Jalisco who cover the cartel operate under threats that have made Mexico one of the deadliest countries in the world for reporters. Municipal officials in CJNG territory have been assassinated in their offices, outside their homes, in front of their families. The violence that funded the lifestyle documented in Laisha's sanctioning was not abstract. It had faces, it had names, it had children who grew up without parents for reasons directly connected to the organization her financial activity helped sustain. That is the part of this story that the photographs of Bengal cats and infinity pools cannot contain. The aesthetic of extreme luxury and the architecture of extreme violence were not opposites in the CJNG's world. They were the same thing, expressed in different registers. The turning point in Laisha's story, the moment the invisible became visible, came through the accumulation of something the cartel had always underestimated: financial forensics. U.S. Treasury Department investigators and their counterparts at the DEA's Financial Intelligence Unit had been building cases against the CJNG's money laundering infrastructure for years before Laisha's sanctioning. The methodology involved not simply tracking transactions, but mapping the networks of beneficial ownership that connected the cartel's revenue to its surface-level assets. Real estate purchases in Jalisco and Colima registered to shell companies whose ultimate beneficial owners traced back to CJNG leadership. Import-export businesses generating invoices for goods that investigators could demonstrate were not actually being shipped in the quantities documented. Restaurant and hospitality businesses in upscale Mexican cities whose cash revenues bore no coherent relationship to their actual customer traffic. Laisha's name appeared in this network not once, but repeatedly, across multiple financial instruments, multiple business registrations, multiple real estate transactions. The investigators building the case were not looking at a single transaction. They were looking at a pattern consistent with systematic money laundering over an extended period. In one documented instance, entities connected to her were linked to real estate transactions in Mexican resort cities, popular with wealthy domestic and international tourists. Transactions whose structures were consistent with the CJNG's established methodology for converting operational cartel revenue into apparently legitimate investment assets. And then the myth collapsed, not in a dramatic raid, not in a moment of capture visible to cameras. It collapsed in a document, a legal instrument issued by the United States Treasury Department on the 21st of April, 2022, that transformed Laisha Oseguera González from the invisible daughter into a publicly identified participant in a criminal enterprise. What the document meant, practically, was total financial isolation from the legitimate global economy. Any U.S. person or entity, and any foreign financial institution that wished to maintain access to the U.S. financial system, was prohibited from conducting transactions with her. Her assets subject to U.S. jurisdiction were frozen. The network of front companies and financial intermediaries she had operated through was now a liability rather than a shield. Every entity connected to her was potentially compromised. Those who have studied the psychology of cartel family members subject to sanctions describe a specific kind of devastation that goes beyond the practical financial consequences. The sanctioning is not simply an economic event. It is a public declaration that the cover story is over, that the narrative of a young woman living a normal, if extraordinarily wealthy, private life has been examined and found to be exactly what it was: a construction. The woman who had been protected by architecture found herself exposed by the very precision of the architecture's documentation. Picture the moment that designation went public, not the Washington bureaucracy of it, the signatures, the press release, the regulatory language, but somewhere in Jalisco, a phone buzzing, a name appearing in news alerts, the realization that the invisibility had ended. Let's remember where we are. Laisha Oseguera González has been sanctioned by the United States Treasury Department. Her financial architecture has been publicly mapped, and her role as an active facilitator of the CJNG's money laundering operations has been officially confirmed. And now, with the full weight of that designation in place, the consequences began to ripple outward in ways that extended well beyond a single family. The thread mentioned earlier, the figure on the periphery of the CJNG's financial structure, whose cooperation eventually helped illuminate the mechanisms connecting Laisha to the cartel's operations, leads here. Federal prosecutions in the United States related to the CJNG's financial networks have, over the years, involved cooperating witnesses who provided investigators with detailed accounts of the cartel's money laundering methodology. While the specific individuals involved in any case building toward the Laisha designation remain protected by the confidentiality of ongoing law enforcement processes, the pattern documented in multiple related cases is consistent. The CJNG's financial network relied heavily on individuals who could interact with legitimate financial and commercial systems without triggering the immediate scrutiny that known cartel operatives would generate. Family members of leadership, particularly those without criminal records, without public profiles, without the kind of surveillance flags that come from direct operational involvement in drug trafficking or violence, were specifically useful for this function. That is the revelation that closes the loop opened at the beginning of this story. Laisha's value to the CJNG was not merely her father's affection. It was her cleanness, her distance from the operational violence, her apparent legitimacy, her ability to function in spaces that El Mencho himself could not access without triggering immediate law enforcement response. She was, in the language of financial crime, a useful distance mechanism, a way of putting a human face on financial structures that needed, above all, to appear unremarkable. The OFAC designation addressed all of that. Once her name appeared on the kingpin list, the cleanness ended. Every financial institution, every business partner, every counterparty in any jurisdiction with ties to the U.S. financial system was now on notice. The distance mechanism had been collapsed. The practical consequences of a kingpin designation are total in their scope. Beyond the asset freezes and transaction prohibitions, the designation carries criminal penalties for any U.S. person who knowingly violates its terms, up to $1 million per violation and up to 30 years in federal prison. Foreign financial institutions that process transactions for designated individuals risk losing their correspondent banking relationships with U.S. banks, a consequence so catastrophic for any institution operating in the global economy that compliance is essentially universal. Laisha's world, the world of private aviation and Jalisco estates, and imported stone and exotic animals, did not simply become more difficult to access. It became, in any jurisdiction connected to the global financial system, functionally inaccessible through the mechanisms that had previously sustained it. The full weight of what the Oseguera family's trajectory represents only becomes clear when you step back far enough to see the shape of it. El Mencho built an empire by learning from his predecessors' mistakes. He watched El Chapo's flamboyance become a liability. The tunnels, the meetings, the girlfriends, the interviews with Sean Penn, the structural overconfidence of a man who believed his legend had made him untouchable. He watched the Arellano Felix brothers destroy themselves through internecine violence. He watched cartel after cartel implode under the weight of leadership structures too dependent on a single individual. And he built something different, an organization with genuine institutional depth, with redundancy built into its leadership and financial structure, with military capability that rivaled state forces, with a media strategy sophisticated enough to shape its own narrative. Part of that architecture was the family. El Menchito was positioned not merely as an heir, but as an operational commander, running enforcement operations in Jalisco before his arrest in 2015. By Mexican federal police acting on intelligence that, sources indicate, involved significant U.S. cooperation, and his eventual extradition to the United States in 2022. Jessica Johanna managed business interests. Laisha managed financial structures. The family was not merely a family. It was a distributed operational system, each member playing a role in the enterprise's resilience. And here is what that cost. The human cost, denominated not in sanctions or asset freezes, but in the specific accounting of what the CJNG's operations produced. According to data compiled by the Mexican government and independent researchers, the CJNG is linked to thousands of homicides in Mexico, a significant portion of the ongoing violence in states including Jalisco, Colima, Michoacán, Guanajuato, and Zacatecas. The fentanyl and methamphetamine distributed through CJNG networks have contributed to overdose deaths across the United States at a scale that the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention has described as a national public health emergency. Fentanyl overdoses alone killed more than 73,000 Americans in 2022, the year of Laisha's sanctioning. The financial structures that Laisha helped maintain were the circulatory system of that operation. The engagement question this story raises is genuine and difficult. How do you hold someone accountable for the full consequences of a system they helped sustain but did not, in any documented sense, personally direct? Where does the daughter end and the participant begin? The law has an answer. The OFAC threshold has been met, the designation issued. But the moral geometry of that question is not resolved by a Treasury Department press release. You'll have your own answer. There is a specific kind of story the cartel world produces with terrible regularity. The story of someone born adjacent to great power who comes to believe that proximity is the same as protection. Laisha Oseguera González grew up in the belief, or was given every reason to maintain the belief, that her father's empire was also her fortress. That the architecture protecting El Mencho, the shell companies, the straw buyers, the layers of financial intermediation, the armed perimeters, extended to her by right of blood. That the rules governing ordinary people's vulnerability simply did not apply to her, any more than they applied to the Bengal cats moving across the imported stone of a Jalisco estate on an afternoon in April. What the 21st of April, 2022 revealed was the precise cost of that belief, not to Laisha alone, to the thousands of families in Jalisco, Colima, Michoacán, and across the United States whose losses were the denominator of the wealth she moved through the world with such practiced ease. The final irony is this. El Mencho built his empire partly to give his children a life he never had, to put them beyond the reach of the poverty and vulnerability that shaped his own beginning. In doing so, he made them instruments of the enterprise that produced exactly those conditions for hundreds of thousands of other families. The fortress was also a trap. The protection was also exposure. And the question that remains, the one that no sanction and no legal designation fully resolves, is this. In a world where the structures of power are specifically engineered to make complicity look like ordinary life, at what point does living inside those structures become a choice for which one is genuinely responsible? What do you think? Is Laisha Oseguera González someone who made active choices that deserve consequences? Or is her story ultimately about something larger? The way extreme power structures corrupt the very concept of individual accountability. Drop your thoughts in the comments. This one genuinely divides people who study cartel dynamics closely. If you made it this far, it's because this kind of story matters to you. The ones that go past the headlines and into the architecture of how these worlds actually function. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Your support is what makes this level of investigation possible. This is where the real stories live, the ones behind the headlines.